We are going to go ahead and get started. Thank you all so much for coming out to join us this evening. My name is Caitlin, and I'm the Executive Director here at the Matheson History Museum. And we are really delighted to be participating in the Bard and Broadside Poetry Festival with E. Stanley Richardson, who, in addition to his many, many credentials, Alachua County Poet Laureate, founder of this festival, he is also one of our board members here at the Matheson, and we are lucky to have him on the team. So today we will be participating in a poetry workshop led by Alejandro Aguirre, and it is centered on our current exhibit, which is in this other room here. So I encourage you to take some time while you're here this evening to check out the exhibit about Black Thursday, which was a civil rights event that happened at the University of Florida in 1971. It will be, what is 71? 52 years tomorrow. I'm a historian, I don't do math. But I really encourage you to check out that exhibit while you're here today. It will be on display for one more week. The last day that is on view will be next Saturday, April 22nd. And then we have an exciting new exhibit opening in May about language diversity in our area. I would like to thank our sponsors on the museum's side of this program, which is Visit Gainesville, Alachua County, the City of Gainesville, and the State of Florida Division of Cultural Affairs for making all of our events and programs happen. And we also rely on our members and donors. So if you like what we're doing, I encourage you to think about becoming a member of the museum. So I'm going to turn it over to E. Stanley Richardson, as well as Jenna, who are two of our festival organizers, to tell you a little bit about the festival.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for being here this evening with us. I am E. Stanley Richardson, the Alachua County Poet Laureate and founder and director of Art Speaks GNV Inc., bringing poetry and people together. This festival came to be, it was just a vision to try to bring together people who centered around poetry and to make Gainesville a future destination for literary artists all over the United States. And this is just I guess, the foundation of that. I want to thank you for being part of the festival. We have a lot of stuff going on. This festival actually kicked off yesterday at the Harn with a community open mic at the Harn Museum Nights, and it was a wonderful event. That's why I'm kind of tired, fatigued a little bit from that. But I want to thank you all for being here, and I'm going to turn it over to Jenna, who's one of the organizers of the festival, also. But thank you so much. I'm looking forward to the workshop. We have tomorrow. One of the things that I'm really excited about is we're going to select the very first North Central Florida Youth Poet Laureate. So if you saw President Biden's inauguration in 2020, there was a young lady there who did a poem. She was the inaugural poet. Her name was Amanda Gorman. She was our very first Youth Poet Laureate in 2017, and this is that particular organization that we're bringing here to youth. I'm very passionate about youth who live in rural communities. I grew up in Alachua, so I know I just want to make sure we kids who live in rural communities have access. So I think this is a wonderful program. And also on Sunday, poet John Morrell will be giving another community poetry workshop at the library headquarters. So thank you all for coming here this evening. Jenna, you want to say a few words? And I always forget the sponsor.
Oh, I'll do the sponsors. Hi there. I'm one of the worker bees for the first ever Bard and Broadside North Central Florida Poetry Festival for this year's event. And I just want to point out that on the table in front of you, there is a pretty little blue flyer that tells you all of the events for the festival. Everything is free. That's one of the things that Stan and Art Speaks works hard to do, is bringing poetry and the arts free to the community. I do also have to thank our sponsors, and some of them are familiar, but we have to thank Hampton Inn and Suites, Campus USA Credit Union, the Harn Museum of Art, the Matheson History Museum, the City of Gainesville, UF Health Cancer Center, the Florida Arts and Culture Division, the Sunrise Rotary Club of Gainesville, the Writers Alliance of Gainesville, the Acrosstown Repertory Theater, who are putting on The Tempest tomorrow at the Thomas Center, and that's also one of our events if you love Shakespeare and theater. The Alachua County Library District, Waste Pro Alachua, the Samuel Proctor Oral History Program and visit Gainesville, Alachua County, Florida. So please do, before you go, on the table there or on the back table, pick up one of our flyers and take it home. Also, on the easel back there, there is a poster of the first event that we had that was not open to the public last week. Stan and art professor Patrick Grisby went into Aquin Jones School and did a text and art workshop with the kids there. And so you can learn about that on that easel. And lastly, if you'd like, the first ever Bard and Broadside North Central Florida Poetry Festival t-shirt, then you can make a donation at the back table. Those are limited edition t-shirts. So, and I'll see you afterwards for that, but I'm going to join the workshop. So thank you very much. And did you want to introduce Alejandro?
All right. So thank you again to Jenna and Stan for partnering with us for this event. And now I am delighted to introduce our leader this evening, Alejandro, who is a finalist for the Atlanta Review's Dan Veach Prize for Younger Poets. His poems are published or forthcoming in Rattle, I-70 Review, Hawaii Pacific Review, and Islandia Journal. And he is going to speak to us a bit about some of the history and the techniques that we'll be using in the workshop today, and then we will dive into it. So without any further ado, come on up.
Hi, everybody. As Caitlin just mentioned, my name is Alejandro. But before I start talking about the poetics of resistance in Gainesville in the States, I do want to extend my thanks, especially to Caitlin and the Matheson Museum for putting this all together. This wouldn't have been possible without you, and I'm very grateful to be talking about such an important history and how it connects to poetry, how poetry can reflect history, and how we can interact with it. I also want to thank Stanley and Jenna and the entire team at Bard and Broadside for including us this weekend. As they already mentioned, there's a lot of great events, and we're grateful to be a part of it. But yes, the poetics of resistance in Gainesville in the States. Today we'll be talking about the history of segregation and racial divisions, both locally and abroad, and how poetry can be a response to that history. But before we can understand poetry's place in history and in the world, we first must understand that history. And it all starts in Gainesville with one particular person, Virgil Hawkins. In 1949, Virgil Hawkins was an aspiring young black man who had dreams of being a lawyer. And he felt that the University of Florida was the best place to pursue those dreams. And so he applied, like any other student would. Mind you, he was a great student. He was on par or above average with every other student regarding academics, extracurriculars, and all the typical criteria that college academics look for in their students, except for one. He was black. He and 5 others were denied admission to the University of Florida solely based on the color of their skin that year. And Virgil Hawkins felt rightfully so that he had been wronged. He had been given the short end of the stick, as it were. And so he took his case to the court, to the Supreme Court of Florida. And for a majority white jury and a white judge, he did not have a reason to be doing so and was denied admission again on the state level to the university. Twice more would Virgil Hawkins plead his case to the Supreme Court of Florida from 1949 to 1957. And those are really important dates because from 1949 to 1957, a lot happens that helps strengthen his case. It really starts with the essential court case of Brown v. Board in 1954. I'm sure that many of you will know from your high school history or those history buffs in here what Chief Judge Earl Warren had said in his majority opinion regarding this case when he wrote it. He understood that there needed to be integration in order to appease outside forces, and the case was set in stone. But he also feared, as did the other judges, that an immediate change may upset the Dixiecrats in the South. And so they used vague wording in their majority opinion. They said that integration had to happen with, I quote, all deliberate speed. That phrasing would be iconic because it would allow for the South to go at their speed, as it were, which is slowly. It's most prevalent, and the most prevalent case was in Little Rock, Arkansas, with, I'm sure you've seen all the photos of the Little Rock Nine. 9 Black students who were admitted into an all-white school in Little Rock. The idea really came from one person who was superintendent of the town, Superintendent Virgil Blossom, who in 1957 came up with, because of outside forces, came up with a plan to both appease those outside forces, but also not move too quickly, which was called the Blossom Plan. The Blossom Plan was basically his way of delaying the integration of Black students into all-white communities by gerrymandering school zones. So in other words, there were a lot of Black students living near Hall High, which was the all-white high school. But by reorganizing the school zones into odd shapes, he was able to enforce that an overwhelming majority of those Black students still went to Horace Mann, which was the historically Black high school in Little Rock. But there needed to be some token of integration, and therefore the Little Rock Nine were born. 9 students brought in with really almost no protection. Every day they had to go police escorted to this school for fear of their life. Now, as the public school system throughout the nation is improving for the better, at the very least slightly on a token case, that same pressure that is enforcing that change is also felt here in Gainesville, particularly with the closing of Lincoln and Mebane. Lincoln and Mebane were both the high school and the middle school, respectively, that housed historically Black students here in Gainesville. Because of outside forces, again, the state requiring Alachua County to make this change, really, they closed Lincoln and Mebane immediately in the middle of the school year, which meant one thing: the only people that were having to change their ways of life were the Black community. And that was a problem, because from the beginning of the 20th century all the way up to 1970, when they closed those 2 schools, Lincoln and Mebane had become cultural epicenters almost for the Black community, a place of a sanctuary, a haven for young students where they can have Black teachers, somebody to look up to who looks like them. And when that closed, those students protested. They protested their rights to have an equal means of reaching integration. Now, this all sets the context, as does the Civil Rights Act in '64 when Lyndon B. Johnson signed that, for what happens in 1971, Black Thursday. But a few months before that, civil rights activist from Mississippi, this also sets the context, Fannie Lou Hamer came into town on a circuit of speeches regarding the importance of peaceful protest to make change. She was a Black woman from Mississippi, low-income housing, that at 12 years old had a horrible, horrible thing done to her: an unwanted and unwarranted hysterectomy. Yes, it was so common in Mississippi that it was called by the medical field in Mississippi the Mississippi appendectomy. They would sedate you for some other surgery and then in the process give you a hysterectomy. It was it was a bigoted act both towards blacks and towards females in Mississippi. And from that point on, she dedicated her life to making a change, to peaceful protests for both the rights of women, the rights of black people, and the rights of black students. So when she came in 1971, and she spoke fervently because she had a background in reciting poetry, that stuck. And that stuck in particular with the black community in the University of Florida. At the time, most black students, which by the way were very few, I'm talking about hundreds out of 20,000 students, which was not representative of the 17% of citizens in Florida that identified as black at the time. Most of those hundreds of students lived off campus because on campus was not welcoming by any means. There are stories that we'll see now in some of the erasures that we'll do from the oral histories provided by the University of Florida and by the Matheson, that, for example, Stephen Mickle, who would go on to be a future judge, recalls stories of when he was a student at the University of Florida, sitting down in a park bench and white people standing up because he had sat down. Even the black custodians and staff would not interact with black students because of how much bigotry they faced from both white faculty and white students at the university. So they felt that presence. They felt it. That so much so that they didn't even live on campus. And those that did really were segregated into two halls, which were South Hall and East Hall, respectively, for the girls and for the females and the males. There was no place for black students, except for in the basement of one of those halls where they communed. And that was where the Black Student Union, as we know it today, was born. There was just a group of black students trying to, and I'm quoting here from the demands that they would list on Black Thursday, improve the stance of the black brothers and sisters at the school. And one night, the eve of Black Thursday, which celebrates its 52nd anniversary today, maybe in a room just like that one, in a dingy room that was about that size, somewhere in a hall, they decided that something needed to be done. Something needed to be done. And they came up with 6 demands to present to President O'Connell. The most important of which was, first off, to start integrating black students more in the freshman classes. So out of the 2,800 that were typically admitted by the university, they asked that at least 500 of those students should be black, as a better representation of the population of Florida. That same idea extended also to the recruitment of black faculty. There were barely any black faculty in 1971 at the University of Florida, except for maybe 1 or 2, one of which was Roy Mitchell, who was a professor at the time at the university. And those first Black Student Union members, who Kip Smith was one of them, he was the head of the Minority Affairs on the Student Council, they asked that Roy Mitchell be instated as the dean of Minority Affairs, which had not existed up to that point. So it was both the idea of creating a Minority Affairs department and putting him at the forefront. They were very reasonable demands. And 66 of those students that were in that basement the following morning walked into Tiggert Hall, which is where his office was at the time, and asked the secretary, may we see President O'Connell? We have something to discuss about our rights. She calls into the office and President O'Connell says no. So they sit there in Tiggert Hall and they wait for him. O'Connell opens the door and says, if you don't leave, I will call the cops and suspend you. And that's exactly what he did. Those 66 students were both suspended and sent to the local jail. Very bad. By 2 o'clock in the afternoon, everybody knew. All the students had found out. And something needed to be done, they realized. Steve Folder, who was the student council president at the time, a white 21-year-old, held an emergency meeting at Plaza of the Americas, where thousands of students gathered. And they raised funds for the bail of those 66 students. But more so than that, they knew that something needed to be done. Just months before, Folder had asked President O'Connell to stop classes on one day as a memoriam for the 4 students who had just very recently at that time died at Kent State, wrongfully shot down by the National Guard, unarmed, mind you. And O'Connell said no. So Folder and the other student council members knew something needed to be changed. The system needed to be changed. And at the head of that system was O'Connell. And they said, O'Connell's got to go. O'Connell's got to go. They chanted it in the air. It was sounding out from Plaza. And the police that surrounded them threw in tear gas into the crowd. Some ran, but others, a majority, stayed. And of that majority, 1,500 students marched onto Ticket Hall. It was so many people that they couldn't even fit inside of that space that those 66 had sat in. They flooded out of the doors. And O'Connell's got to go. O'Connell's got to go, they chanted. Of course, O'Connell knew he needed to do something. So he calls in a Folder into his office, the head of the student council. And a Folder starts to feel the weight of his job. The necessity to represent the reasonable demands of Black students, which he represented as the student council president. But of course, he's 21. And O'Connell's a grown man. O'Connell closes the door behind him. It's just him and O'Connell. And he says, control them, control them. If not, I will suspend and send every single one of you to jail. And like I said, O'Connell's 21. And he felt a need to make a decision. So he goes outside and he asks the crowd to leave, thinking that he diffused the situation. And in some ways he did. But others saw him as a traitor. And those people stayed. He gave one more warning. O'Connell gave one more warning. They didn't move. By 4 o'clock, the police were waiting outside. A massive crowd of police that had come in 2 school buses to take these students away to the jail, to arrest them. But there was just too many of them. There was too many students. And so the cops couldn't do anything. They slashed the tires of the school bus and it was victorious. And some of those students later on in the day even went to O'Connell's house and sat on his presidential lawn as he gave an interview with the WUFT, which still exists today, trying to diffuse the situation that had happened early in the day. They weren't outside on his lawn. O'Connell's got to go. O'Connell's got to go. And O'Connell knew that he was defeated. He opened the door and he said the only thing he could say, welcome. You and I both know that nothing productive is going to happen tonight. May you leave? And somebody out from the crowd calls out, will you resign? He says, no, I mean, he's not going to resign. And so they stay there and chant. 30 minutes later, O'Connell and his wife walk out that door, police escorted to a safe place. By 1973, O'Connell resigns, perhaps because of the weight of this scenario. And from 1971 to 1972, the Institute of Black Culture, not the one that we know today on university, but its predecessor, was built and founded. There was finally a place for the Black Student Union. Excuse me. And more so than that, Roy Mitchell, that same person that I had mentioned, the faculty member, was the first dean in 1962, the first black, 1972, excuse me, the first black dean at the University of Florida. It had worked. The demands were met. And in some ways, it started progressing. The university started progressing. It started looking for the needs of minority students. But so many decades removed from that one day, how can we relate it to the modern day? How can we reflect on this eve of the anniversary of such a momentous day in Gainesville? And how can we interact with that being of different walks of life? Oh, by the way, those are the first 66. I didn't move there. But those are the first 66 as they walked into Tigger Hall. Amy King had asked a question in her speech of acceptance of the Women's National Book Association Award. How can we humanize in our minds those voices we don't encounter? And she came to a conclusion which I also have come to through writing, through fiction, through poetry. And there are a lot of examples from the history books and also from modern day poets. One of those poets is Natasha Trethewey, whose collection, The Native Guard, talks about being a Black person in modern day America, and especially in the Civil War, and how those two are connected. I'd like to read you one of her poems now. And this one's called South, and it starts with an epigraph. Homo sapiens is the only species to suffer psychological exile. I return to a stand of pines, bone-thin phalanx, flanking the roadside, tangle of understory, and a dialectic of dark and light, and magnolias blossoming like afterthought, each flower a surrender, white flags draped among the branches. I return to Land's End, the swath of coast cut clear and buried in the sand. Mangrove, live oak, gulfweed raised and replaced by thin palms, palmettos, symbols of victory or defiance, over and over marking this vanquished land. I returned to a field of cotton, hollowed ground, as slave legend goes, each bowl holding the ghosts of generations, those who measured their days by the heft of sacks and lengths of rows, whose sweat flecked the cotton plants still sewn into our clothes. I returned to a country battlefield, where colored troops fought and died. Port Hudson, where their bodies swelled and blackened beneath the sun. Unburied until Earth's green sheet pulled over them, unmarked by any headstones. Where the roads, buildings, and monuments are named to honor the Confederacy. Where that old flag still hangs. I return to Mississippi, state that made a crime of me. Mulatto, half-breed, native in my native land, this place they'll bury me. And before I start talking about this, I'm curious, what is everybody feeling? Is there anything that stood out in the poem today for anybody?
Thinking, like those troops, they fought alongside everyone else, and they so disrespected and couldn't be buried. It just says that they were taking over buried.
Yeah. There were almost, Truthaway alludes, too many bodies to bury. Too many people to look back at their face and say, I knew this person. And you're very right. With the troops coming in from the very beginning, they're flanking the roadside, that phalanx, that group of police in close formation. But it's also a very well used word, because it's with the usage of bone thin, it's almost referring to the phalanx bones. From the beginning, we're talking about mortality. And for those of you that don't know, Port Hudson was a very important place as well, because in May 1863, at the height of the Civil War, there was a siege on Port Hudson. It was one of the last Union attempts to regain the control of the Mississippi River, but it failed. Up to that point, it had been the longest siege in history for the United States, 48 days. And General Garner only surrendered it after the fall of Vicksburg. For those of you that know Civil War history, the marking and turning point of the war. So she's talking about history and bringing it into the modern day because she returns to that place. She returns to that moment even and feels that same sense of being a crime because of her skin. Similarly, Rowan Ricardo Phillips has a great collection on what it means to be a black man today in the United States. And I'd like to read you this quickly. It's called Night of the Election. Then Seamus Heaney's poem, suddenly gone. The words become a thing looked at, not read. But then those too went the way of Patron, blanketing whatever dim light November had let in. In the poem's place, an oyster appeared on a plate. Languid, the color of vanilla, moist flannel, raw silver, crushed hay, sunk ships, Kints, and Jupiter. Flexing taut, then slack, then taut in its shell. How, with all that's happened, it managed to be there, that gorged bulb glistening? Well, here's what I'd tell you. But a ghoulish creamsicle flavor ruined the moment. A sad irreverence, not reverent. I know that this one might be a little bit harder to grasp, but maybe those first lines give us an idea that will be more understood, and something that I'm sure that we've all heard. He says Seamus Heaney's poem, which poem, has become a thing looked at, not read. I'm sure that you all remember during Biden's presidential run, he would often quote Seamus Heaney, and one particular passage from his verse adaptation of the Cure of Troy by Sophocles, which goes, "History says, don't hope on this side of the grave." But then, once in a lifetime, that longed-for tidal wave of justice can rise up, and hope and history rhyme. Here, Rowan Ricardo Phillips calls into question how poetry has adapted into the modern day and how it's become a political tool rather than something meaningful almost. It's gone the way of Patron, almost the way of a a drunkard, as it were. And then all that we're left with at the end is this sad shell, this sad oyster that just flexes and unflexes because it's helpless on that plate that we're about to eat. This last one, and then we're going to get to the fun stuff. I feel like I've been talking for quite a while. I'll read it quickly. It's by Jericho Brown. It's called Meditations at the New Orleans Jazz Historical National Park. Dear Tondent, we still love you and love what it means to be a black college president's son, whose pride and rebellion looks like men in the 7th Ward. They groaned for you, and ain't that music too? Bodies of several shades arranged for one sound of want, or without, or wish a Negro would. Come back home, little light skin. Come give daddy a kiss. Anybody have any thoughts about this one? feelings, something that stands out? Question. Great question. Okay, so he's referencing to Thomas Covington Dent, who was a poet in his own right and also a historian. He wrote a nonfiction book, which was really important to civil rights activism in the 1960s, called The Southern Journey, A Return to the Civil Rights Movement. It was basically a travelogue where he traveled throughout the whole South and encapsulated his experiences returning to famous Civil War sites, including Port Hudson, which we just mentioned. He was the son of the president of Dillard University, a historically black school, and he recorded a lot of oral histories in Mississippi with civil rights workers. So when Jericho Brown brings up that he looks like the men in the Seventh Ward, it's because he was interviewing those men. Seventh Ward was a very, and it still is, a very pertinent Creole neighborhood in Mississippi, where a lot of jazz innovators have been born and raised. For example, Lionel Furbeau's was an innovative trumpeter, Ferdinand Lamoth, aka Jelly Roll Morton, and more recently, the Marvel actor Anthony Mackie, and also singer-songwriter Frank Ocean. So when he's calling in the Seventh Ward, he's calling in a history of jazz innovation and how that relates to the Civil War movement through the identity of Thomas Dent. And so these examples all show how history and music and what we experience in the modern day, the imperative, come back home, give daddy a kiss, that's in the present. That's in the present moment. It shows that the past and the present aren't too far away. It's all interconnected, and there are ways to reach it through poetry. Which brings us to the fun part. Today, we'll be doing two really cool activities. The first of which was invented by the surrealists, who were a group of artists and writers in the early 20th century that were focused on the chaotic elements of life, called the exquisite corpse. Now, this technique, it started off as a fun game, but then became very serious. Basically, what would happen is, it's easier to explain in visual art, but it also works for writing, as the surrealists found out. You take a blank piece of paper or a blank canvas. The first person starts drawing on the bottom of it, or painting on the bottom, leaving a few lines to rise up to where it would fold. He folds the majority of his painting away and is left with a few lines here that inspire what the next person down draws or paints. And he folds away the majority, and there's only a few lines. He paints, or she paints, whoever it is, fold away. And by the time that you're done, you have a piece that is unique in the sense that it would have never been created had it not been for the communal work and the communal aspect of it. Today, we'll be doing something similar, maybe talking about what we've learned today or what we felt in our daily lives, how this relates to the history of Gainesville and segregation in Gainesville, or whatever the case may be in your own personal life as well. The second option, for those of you that are a little bit shy when it comes to working in groups, is an erasure poem, which basically is when you take a source text and rather than writing new words, you erase what's there to then come up with something new. There are some examples that I did for this presentation on the table, which I'm sure we'll pass around now. But as you can see in the picture, the idea is to just cross out and then end up with something unique. Of course, since we're talking about such a tense history, in a time when it's very easy to forget that history, there are certain issues when it comes to erasing, as it were. I've included in those samples a link to amazing article that the Poetry Foundation has on this, where basically the author concludes that so long as you're in, conscious of the intent of the original writer and trying to emulate that in a sense, there is a certain justification for it because you place yourself immediately in that history, and by doing so, feel more of what it might have felt like to be in that history. I would highly recommend that essay if you get the chance. But that's the basic concept of what we're going to be doing today. I'll pass around a piece of paper. We'll each write 2 lines and fold away the first. So that the next person down the row, let's say I'm passing it to Jenna, only sees 1 line, and from that 1 line is inspired to write the next 2 until we reach all the way to the end. How's that sound? Great. Exactly, but the second one has to be there. Perfect. Great. So everybody's excited? Perfect. There are a whole bunch of Sharpies and pencils on the table. If anybody has any questions, feel free. I'll be here to help. That's what I'm here for. But let me start organizing this. Who wants to start the collaborative poem? That's the fun question. Yes, I love the enthusiasm, Jenna. Okay, let's get to it. I'm gonna help pass around stuff. Thank you all so much.
Excerpts from different interviews or estimates that amounts. I'll curate those pieces, my favorite reasons. The very long ones that made it. Yeah. So now I'm going to do like that. It's the arranger. Yeah. The ones that's useful. I was. Um, just that that is for the introducers. Yes. No, we keep
Seems like we have something final here. Yeah, very nice. Let's give ourselves a round of applause. Yeah, very nice. Woo! Thank you all so much for participating. So at first I thought that maybe we could each read the lines, but then I realized, you know what? Maybe let's keep some of the mystery, which is the fun parts. Who wrote what? Okay, but I'll just read out what we have here. It's a lovely little poem. Okay. The poet's imaginary magnolia flower, fennel, oyster, whitewashed history. Overcome, come home, colorful souls, bright and radiant love, proud to present and able this time, because this is the time. As loneliness furrows into a dark bend, we realize our strength in solitude, in a bower. Jesus-like, someone cries from the cotton fields, and I'm at the veranda, years later, silent. Bottled inside, streams of sight almost secluded, struggling to find an outlet. But who gets left behind? My outlet becomes their prison. The bars of that prison built with segregation. They put up with bars of division in a lonely, selfish way. Will surely rot away in right of surest justice on that inevitable reckoning day. Very nice. Wow. Applause to all of you. Very great. Very great. Wow. I love that. I love that. And we still have some time here. Does anybody want to read their erasures? Yes.
The readings that you're providing, so reading.
Oh, they're great. Yeah, I I highly recommend. I'm sure it's there. One of the links. The let's see. It's one of the. Maybe it's not. The Samuel Proctor Oral History has a massive database of interviews with not only blacks that have lived in Gainesville, but also in the southeastern region of the United States, and every single one of them has something great to offer. I mean, that 10-pager was really just an act of love because you start reading. I think it was Judge Mickle's interview. You start reading his interview, and it's just fascinating. It's so riveting. So even if you're just interested in reading it, I would highly recommend grabbing a copy of that one too. Yeah. But yes, Jenna. All right, introducing Jenna.
I found it harder to make a poem than just to make a summary, which is, so we'll call it a poetic summary. But this was an interview with George Allen in 2012, and he was a student back in the day. And here is the blackout poem. 1958, change going on. College students, FAMU, we turned the bus over. We rocked it until it turned over. The administration, afraid. Down students to the Supreme Court, blacks in the balcony. Listen to Virgil Hawkins' case. The man, indefatigable, hell-bent on changing the system, knew he may not see the promised land, sacrificed himself, career, family, everything, but kept going. He'd win, they would appeal. He'd go back, they would appeal. He stayed the course, kept going, he won. They were still fighting it. He made a deal. I won't go to the University of Florida if you let other blacks go. So I got there. Virgil cut a deal. I won't go if you let my black friends go.
And when I was done, I realized there was a second side. Uh, so I was really concise on the second side. Um, he stepped down so that he could talk about it. A lot of stuff was going on. And he had that step. He had the power. He used to call the dean's office the white office. White laughter. No blacks. Yes. But they kept her in there because they had to have a minority. They gave her a hard, hard time. She used to cry a lot. They gave her a really, really hard time. And what made them? I don't know. It was my job.
Lecture from George Allen, who did with Rowan Ricardo. Stay on that you ran with everyone's.
You left something bubbling, physically turned over, rocked and arrested. The overturning, the segregated system that white and blacks were afraid, discouraged, protesting the board of control, everyone, yes, except in the balcony. So militant. He kept doing it. Yes, impressions, hell bent, promised land, sacrifice supreme. Let my black friends go.
Oh, great. Let's see. My baptism by fire, as it were. I feel like I cheated because I did this before, so I've had more time than you did. But that being said, let's talk about it. The Scramble at Tigert Hall. I started this poem with an epigraph from Oldawa Okinawa. I always struggle to pronounce his name. He was a slave who later liberated himself and learned to read and write. And on his biography, he wrote of the scramble slave auction, which was a type of auction in which basically the blacks were left in a dark room, the doors opened, and the whites would come swarming in. And it was almost a first come, first serve basis. You grab the one that you want to pay for. Speaking of that scrambled auction, he said, to the merchant's yard, where we were all pent up together like so many sheep in the fold. It was non-Americana. Vietnam, a protest savant. Time of scribes, the first sit-into. The second group sat on paper wads. those intimate spheres of asking. Things, now want things to happen. We, a school bus, to leave us at the jail. Thank you. And thank you all so much. You have been great tonight, and I'm very grateful for every single one of you coming out, and for Jenna, Stanley, Caitlin, everything that made this possible. Thank you all. I'll see you. Awesome. And don't forget the events tomorrow and on Sunday. The commencement ceremony is tomorrow from 3 to 5, and then on Sunday, John Murillo. Don't miss that one. And grab a t-shirt.